Leia, after the Battle of Endor and the formation of the New Republic, served as a New Republic senator and then chief of state for several terms, but there's one problem. Didn't her planet explode? So who did Leia represent? The short answer to this is still Alderaan, but what did that actually mean, and how did Alderaan manage to have representation in the Senate despite having been blown up? The answer actually pulls some inspiration from both the Old Republic and the real world, but there's also some elements which point out some inconsistencies in the way representation in the Senate has worked in Star Wars lore over the years. Despite the lack of any remaining territory, Alderaan maintained a seat in the New Republic Senate for those who had survived the planet's destruction by being off-world at the time, like Leia herself. As we see in the courtship of Princess Leia, this representation in government existed not just at the federal level in the New Republic, but also as a governing body for the survivors themselves with the Alderaanian Council, led by President Threkin Horm in around 8 ABY. This council was likely not involved in administrating much territory, especially at first, but they probably would have been involved with setting up programs for Alderaanian refugees. This would have been a considerable number of displaced people without many resources left. They also talk about how a lot of the people who had survived the destruction of Alderaan were traitors, and by the time of the courtship of Princess Leia, which is only set a couple years after Endor, most of the Alderaanians had given up on the prospect of establishing a new Alderaan, but we'll get back to that in a moment. Another Legends novel, Children of the Jedi, mentions another Alderaanian political body, the Alderaan Alliance, which had compiled a list of those involved in the creation of the Death Star as targets for justice. But we don't get much context for what the group actually is, so it sounds to me more like it was either a political party or simply an activist group aimed at seeking justice for the destruction of the planet. But Alderaan was not unique in getting representation in the Senate despite not actually existing as actual territory within the New Republic, with its constituents spread throughout other locales. Corellia was in a similar, though less tragic position considering their planet hadn't been obliterated. Corellia decided to maintain its independence for quite some time after Endor, and even in the immediate aftermath of Endor, it was still under the thumb of the Diktat, Daclith Galambi, who had aligned with local Imperials. Despite this, Senator Dorman Barris was elected to represent Corellian exiles within the New Republic almost immediately. She'd been a leading figure within the Rebel Alliance, signing the Declaration of the New Republic, and then had served within the Executive Provisional Council, working directly with the New Republic's first Chief of State, Mon Mothma, despite Corellia itself still not being a member of the New Republic. And more importantly, despite Corellia also not liking this video and subscribing for more, which you can do right now. It's a bit easier to see why this would have been so common in the early days of the New Republic especially. For many planets or sectors, there would have been a lot of political or military leaders within the fledgling government, but the worlds themselves remained under imperial control. So given the New Republic's claim that they were the legitimate government, not the Empire, these senators would simply be representing occupied territory until that situation changed. Corellia was a bit different because it did intentionally remain independent after being freed from the Empire. But for Alderaan, since the planet was destroyed, not occupied, this obviously wasn't going to ever change. Instead, Leia, as senator for the Alderaanians, was representing a constituency of fully displaced peoples, rather than having the Alderaanian refugees be integrated into other constituencies. While never given the same name, this is actually very similar in concept to something that had existed under the Galactic Republic, functional constituencies. These constituencies were introduced later on in the Republic's history, but still 1,000 years before the Clone Wars, with the sweeping Ruusan reformations, allowing representation for non-territorial entities in the Senate, meaning they were a constituency that represents a function rather than territory. Almost 900 years later, about 100 years before the Clone Wars, this was even extended to corporate entities like the Trade Federation, which is how the Trade Federation was able to have a seat in the Senate that we see in Episode 1, contributing to the downfall of the Republic, but initially functional constituencies were a way for enclaves of species or other cultural groups to be represented within the Senate directly, so this was very similar to the situation with Leia and the Alderaanians. Functional constituencies are actually a real political idea, and they exist, for example, in Macau and Hong Kong, and formerly in China, where elected groups included these kinds of non-geographic constituencies, usually representing a specific trade, currently including catering, tourism, and social welfare in Hong Kong. It's a kind of similar idea to corporatism, where political society is organized into corporate groups. This doesn't refer to corporations as businesses, but rather that kind of different grouping of economic or social or even class groups. In Hong Kong, the existence of functional constituencies has been a source of significant protest. It's unclear what exactly is used to determine eligibility for voting as an Alderaanian, since presumably they can't vote for both the senator from their temporary homeworld and for their Alderaanian representative, especially since we know Alderaanian representation in the Senate extends several decades after the planet's destruction. So most of the people considered Alderaanian probably wouldn't have lived on Alderaan itself at any point in their life. But we know this extended for a while because Leia was actually only one of 2 chiefs of state to have come from Alderaan, as her successor as senator from Alderaan was Cal Omas, who went on to become chief of state of the New Republic and then Galactic Alliance from 28 to 40 ABY, or years after the Battle of Yavin. After Alderaan was destroyed, there were also efforts made to re-establish the population somewhere and give them a new homeworld, which was accomplished to at least some extent by the planet New Alderaan, although progress on actually getting established was slowed by the fact that the planet, despite supposedly being a safe haven, was repeatedly invaded by Imperials. So at some point when it was sufficiently established, it is possible New Alderaan was taken as the basis for a regular astrographic constituency, rather than remaining something like the Old Republic's functional constituencies. And citizenship there probably applied regardless of whether or not any of the former Alderaanians had actually moved to New Alderaan. The second factor to consider here, though, is that while most books talk as if senators represent just one planet, typically source books will lay out that they in fact represent sectors or groupings of multiple planets. In this case, it's possible that while Leia and Cal get described as the senators from Alderaan in the way that Padme or Palpatine is the senator from Naboo, you could actually take that to mean the Alderaanian sector. This is usually done to help account for the fact that there's sometimes millions of planets referred to as being in the Old and then New Republic, at least when it gets going, sometimes even multiple in the same system, and this allows them to keep things on a reasonable scale in the Senate. But especially because this doesn't seem to be the intent of the prequel trilogy, it's an area where the lore is pretty fuzzy, because you basically get a different take on it from every author, every movie, and every sourcebook. Notably, Alderaan did have a smaller, less populated planet still surviving in its system called Leia, not to be confused with Princess Leia, which seems like it was included in Alderaan's sphere of influence and representation before. So that at least fits with the idea that Leia and Cal represented the sector, with the rest of the sector, specifically Leia, still existing, and then New Alderaan may have been kind of tacked on despite the significant distance, with Alderaan being in the core and New Alderaan being in the rim, much closer to Mon Calamari. Luckily, New Alderaan was within another mostly dead sector called the Ash World, so there probably wouldn't have been significant overlap in representation there. But how this ties into other local representation is another big question. We don't know if there was another local government or local representative that might have overlapped with, and we also don't know if future generations of Alderaanians could have continued living off-world on other planets while still maintaining the ability to vote for the representative of Alderaan. Unfortunately, while we've covered a lot of possible explanations for how all this works, and I think any of them could make sense, it's a situation where there isn't necessarily one clean answer that fits all the lore. I have done a much deeper dive into Senate representation in the Old Republic if you'd like to hear more about all this, but otherwise, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Special thanks again to the patrons whose names you're seeing on screen right now for making it possible for me to make these kinds of videos.